Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bailey Muller. I'm a senior planner at the North Central Texas Council of Governments. Katy Evans with the City of Dallas is alongside of me for this presentation. We want to thank the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas for having us here for this lunch session. Today, we'll be talking about some of the benefits of electric vehicle charging at multi-unit dwellings. We will have time at the end for any questions, but if you want to let us know in the chat function, any sort of questions or topics you'd like to cover in this, please let us know. And so I'll pass this over to Katy Evans with the City of Dallas to talk over their comprehensive climate action plan and some of the stuff City of Dallas is doing in this sector.
Great. Thank you so much, Bailey. And thank you everyone for being here today. As Bailey mentioned, my name is Katy Evans. I'm a climate coordinator with the City of Dallas Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability. And so today, to kick this off, I just wanted to speak briefly about the city's comprehensive environmental and climate action plan, or as I will refer to it in this presentation, CECAP. And so I want to start by introducing CECAP. Next slide, please. On May 27th of last year, so just shy of a year ago, the City Council, City of Dallas Council, unanimously adopted the city's first ever climate action plan. Now, this was the result of over a year of stakeholder outreach and coalition building and engagement with the community. And as a result, we have this incredible plan that contains 97 actions over 30 years across 8 goals, which I will speak about briefly in just a moment. Next slide, please. So at the core of this plan, I want to read this quote from our mayor, Eric Johnson, because this really summarizes the vision and the goals of the CECAP. And so with equity and inclusion as core values, the CECAP proposes solutions that will improve our natural environment, our educational and economic outcomes, the affordability of our housing stock, and our transportation systems. And so I want to focus today on those transportation systems, as well as energy efficiency and air quality in the city of Dallas as it relates to electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging. But first, let's talk about some of the environmental challenges that we're going to see in Dallas in the time ahead. Next slide, please. So we know that in the next 30 years or so, we're going to see an increase of average annual temperature. We're going to see air quality issues exacerbated by that increasing heat. We can also see more flooding and drought. And as we saw just a few months ago, we can potentially see severe winter weather as well. And I want to emphasize the fact that even though I understand a lot of you may be from other cities outside of Dallas, since this is the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas, that these climate challenges are not only going to impact the city of Dallas. Our greenhouse gas emissions do not stop at the city lines. And so this is truly a regional approach, and we want to make sure that we are working with our neighboring cities and constituents in other parts of DFW to work towards improving the environment and mitigating climate change throughout the North Texas region. So next slide, please. And so where are these greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change coming from? Well, in the city of Dallas, we know that 64% of our emissions come from the buildings and energy sector, the combined buildings and energy sector. But more than a third come from the transportation sector. Now, this isn't just people in their personal vehicles. This is also over the road hauling of goods and other transportation networks as well. And so we know that a lot of our residents are driving in cars by themselves. And we also know that our public transportation network, even though it's very large, it is not necessarily the most efficient due to land use patterns. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of our CECAP goals as well. The remaining greenhouse gas emissions come from industrial processes and solid waste and wastewater treatment. So next slide, please. So how are we addressing these 4 areas of emissions? Well, we've created this massive plan, as I mentioned, a 30-year plan that's divided up into 8 goals. And those 8 goals have to do with buildings, energy, transportation, solid waste, water resources, ecosystems, food and urban agriculture, and air quality. And each of these goals have a number of actions within them that contribute to the mitigation of greenhouse gases, the adaptation to the coming changes caused by the climate change, improving quality of life or environmental quality in the city of Dallas, and addressing environmental justice issues in the city of Dallas. And so, as I mentioned, each of these actions have multiple benefits. They also contribute to things like job creation, improving water quality, and providing educational skills or training, things like that. Each of these actions also improve quality of life overall for our residents. So today I want to focus a little bit more on that transportation sector. Next slide, please. And that's goal 3. Dallas communities have access to sustainable, affordable transportation options. And here you have an image of a car charging up at the City of Dallas Zoo. Next slide, please. So how are we doing this? What are our goals for this particular sector? In this image, you have a picture of a DART bus, an electric DART bus. So we're looking at moving surface transportation to fuel efficient vehicles or electric vehicles. We want to ensure that our transportation networks, whether they are active transportation or vehicular transportation infrastructure, are reliable and safe. And we have a goal by 2030 to install 1,500 publicly available EV charging stations to support 39,000 vehicles. We understand that the public transportation network is not always the most efficient, and that right now, City of Dallas, as it is more conducive to driving vehicles. And so we want those vehicles to be as efficient as possible to reduce pollution and decrease emissions. So why is this important? Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the transportation sector contributes 34% of our greenhouse gas emissions for the city of Dallas. And I also mentioned that, a lot of our residents drive to work alone, and that we have that light rail station or system that's not necessarily the best, the most efficient for our residents. I also want to mention that the city of Dallas has itself applied for the grant that you're going to hear about shortly, and is going to be installing a number of charging stations on City of Dallas property as well. So we are practicing what we preach, and we want to see this program expanded throughout the region. Next slide, please. And so the way we're doing that is getting the word out by partnering with the North Central Texas Council of Governments on this electric vehicle charging grant that's available through the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And so with that, I am thrilled to turn it back over to Bailey, who is going to speak much more in depth about what it's like to apply for this grant and some of the benefits that can come from this program through TCQ and the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust. So Bailey, turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Our work with City of Dallas has been integral in trying to get this word out. The furthest reach we can get and the most advancements we can get within kind of pushing this is getting that word and making sure people are aware of the different funding availabilities that are out there. And so before you take advantage of funding, we wanted to go over and make sure you had a full kind of awareness of what the benefits are of getting and pursuing electric vehicle charging at multi-unit dwellings. So who are we? The North Central Texas Council of Governments is the regional planning agency for North Central Texas. And we do hold a couple different hats. We are the regional planning agency, we're the metropolitan planning organization, which basically means we get all the federal funding to do transportation projects. And then we are the local Clean Cities Coalition, which we are called the Dallas-Fort Worth Clean Cities Coalition. And that's a local Department of Energy chapter of a national program that focuses on reducing transportation energy impacts. In transportation, the reason why we focus on air quality specifically is that our region is actually an ozone non-attainment. And so we focus a lot on electric vehicles because the majority of our emissions within our region are actually produced from the transportation sector that are causing this harmful ozone. We believe that higher EV adoption rates because of their low emissions may help further decrease these ozone trends. And then we are able to further try to get towards our goal. When we're talking about EVs in Texas, there are actually a couple different EVs that fall within that definition. Fuel cell electric vehicles, those are those hydrogen fuel cells. They are a little less common. They're not commercially available in Texas yet. They're mainly focused within California and Oregon area, but those are considered a zero emission vehicle. Plug-in electric vehicles, they have an internal combustion gasoline engine as well as a smaller battery. And so while they are considered an electric vehicle, they can only go for a smaller range, approximately probably less than 50 miles before they have to go into that gasoline engine. And then there's the battery electric vehicles, which are fully electric. They do not have any backup engine of any sorts. They are larger batteries, so they can go further range, but when that depletes, they do have to fully recharge. As of April 2021, we have almost 40,000 EVs across Texas. And of that, almost 28% of those are those plug-in hybrid electrics, and 72% of them are those full battery electric vehicles. In North Texas, of that number, we have 14,615 EVs in just our region. But over the last 5 years, we have observed a 32.5% annual growth every year for the last 5 years. And so those numbers are rapidly changing. And while today we are only 0.6% of all vehicles in North Texas, we are seeing that number increase at a very fast rate. And so all of our data, we do track this in-house and do analysis on DMV vehicle registration data. And so we do have a bunch of interactive tools that you can see and utilize in order to get a better kind of vision of where EVs are within your region, within your zip code. You can go onto our tools and kind of zoom in. You could see makes and models of where is in your zip code, or just in general from your city, where are the different pockets and how many EVs are in your specific area. Why we're talking about this today, while it's only 0.6% of all vehicles in North Texas today, there are projections that are anticipating electric vehicles could be up to 55% of all vehicles by 2040. And so that's a less than 20-year turnaround to get from less than 1% of vehicles to over 50% of the vehicles on the road. And so because of that, we're trying to do a lot of work as the planning agency to foresee that change and make sure buildings are ready, people are ready, cities are ready. And so that includes infrastructure and charging stations, which is why we're here talking about the different ways you can incorporate those charging stations to anticipate that growth before it hits really big. The auto industry is also foreseeing this shift. You can see some of the forecasts here and the changes and goals that some of the different auto manufacturers are and have released so far. This is not a comprehensive list. This is a small list of the many auto industry OEMs that have released numbers thus far, but you can see almost all of the different auto manufacturers have either created a goal of how many EVs they'll have in their line and their fleet by a certain year, or the amount of money that they're investing into doing research and development on this topic. So while we have forecasts from the side of how many vehicles we think are going to be on the road, we're seeing that in the auto industry is kind of confirming that with how they're changing and the makes and models of they'll have for availability that people can actually purchase. When you have vehicles, you have to charge them. And so when we talk about charging, there's more than one different solution for charging. They vary it in different categories. So there's level 1 charging, level 2 charging, and then DC fast charging. Level 1 charging is the slowest type of charge. They typically don't have those in publicly available areas. That's kind of that standard outlet. So you're only getting around 2 to 5 miles per 1 hour of charge. That would be comparable to someone just plugging in into their house at home. But in general, level 2 is by far the most common type of charging station. There's approximately 3,000 of those publicly available across Texas. And then for this DC fast charge, those are those really fast ones. They are a little bit more expensive, but those are ones that are placed at a little bit more specific spots that people aren't going to be there for an extended period of time and really need to get that quick charge. And there's almost 275 of those across Texas. But like I mentioned before, based upon your location type and the average time spent where that vehicle is going to be spending there, different charging levels may be better suited for others. If the car is going to be at a place for a longer period of time, you don't have to have that quick charge. And so from a multi-unit dwelling and multifamily perspective, most people are going to be there for overnight. That's their home. And so the Department of Energy does estimate that more than 80% of EV drivers do their charging at home. And so when people are living in multi-unit dwellings, most of the time they don't have the ability to have their own garage where they can charge up. And so it's kind of the responsibility and planning of the property manager and the property site in general to try to make sure that there's plans in place where tenants are able to figure out, are they able to get an EV? Are they able to charge on site? And kind of what the plans are for that. Oops. And this is a breakdown kind of just generally, there's two different things showing on this map. A visual depiction of electric vehicle adoption in North Texas today. The top layer are those dots. Those are the different types of publicly available stations today. This is all found through the Alternative Fuel Data Center. You can access these stations. They are the public stations. So this is not comprehensive at every station. These are just ones that people can access all the time. And then that background kind of color is the EV registration. And so the darker the color, it means the more EVs are registered within that zip code. And so you can see it is clustered towards the north side, but as we are anticipating EVs to grow, we want to make sure that there's going to be that equitable investment of stations, as well as we're anticipating that growth of EVs with more models coming out, more affordable models to expand and get darker across the region. Like I kind of alluded to a little bit ago, there are a lot of benefits for charging to be added at multi-unit dwellings. They can attract and retain residents and tenants. They can be listed as an added amenity. If someone has an EV and they're looking at a property that doesn't have charging, and then their other property that they're looking at does have charging, if you have that vehicle that you need to charge overnight, that's going to be kind of a push to decide where you're going to live and determining if you're going to stay somewhere. It can get you ahead. Proactively making buildings ready for forecasting that EV shift early is beneficial for you, and it can save you money because you're able to kind of consolidate construction costs. You're able to figure out when it is best to kind of move forward with the project, things like that. Charging stations can also contribute towards building certifications, green building certifications, such as LEED. And when buildings are green building certified, that can reduce insurance rates as well. And then at the end, it's a positive image. It's marketable, it's eco-friendly. And so there's really not many cons to having this added amenity at your property. We personally try to develop and try to promote this as much as possible. So we've developed a couple resources in-house to try to make sure people are aware of it, and we can distribute that just so it's an added, easier thing for people just to kind of understand the benefits. And so of our region, approximately 18.2% of residents in the Dallas-Fort Worth-Arlington urbanized area do live in apartments. So that's 18.2% of people that we possibly see are not having access to charging right now that possibly could. And so that's why we want to focus on this multifamily stuff. We know that money is a big factor and not everyone has unlimited funds. And so we as an agency love to track different funding opportunities that are available. And so this is what this is focusing on right now, and what a lot of this timing of why we're presenting this right now is because there is a lot of funding available right now for stations, especially for that multifamily side. We have been working with the city of Dallas for the last couple months trying to do a multifamily analysis for multifamily properties within the city limits. And so basically this is just a very brief, I'm not going to go into too many details of it, but we've been doing an analysis of using our EV registration data as well as current sites and where and what sites we found that actually have EV charging as an amenity today. And so we're trying to do that analysis and see kind of where those gaps are, where the EVs are registered at a multifamily site, who has charging and who needs charging, and then how we can expand that and how we can basically help create a better storyline to try to get Dallas to be a little bit more well distributed for charging for these drivers. And so right now we're trying to focus, it's really difficult to find because multifamily charging isn't necessarily publicly available. It can be behind a fence, it can be in a garage. And so it's hard for us to find that unless you have it listed on your website. And that requires a lot of different research from people to be able to find. So we are asking as a kind of a call to action, if you guys have EVSE which is the electric vehicle supply equipment. If I didn't explain that before, if you have EVSE on your property, please let us know. We would love to have you listed. We would love to have that in our analysis and be able to manage that kind of regional perspective on who has charging and how charging is growing. And so bringing EV charging to your property, how we want to do that and what are the steps you have to do and what different considerations to take into account. And so this is kind of a 5-step process, just broken down. As easy as we kind of thought, properties are difficult because there's not one type of multifamily. There's a lot of different aspects of different property types. And so first step, assess current and future funding, future charging needs. Second, determine property considerations and different policies. 3, engage your utility. 4, funding, installation, operation considerations. And then 5, ultimately, ensure visibility and promote once those stations are there. And so to assess current and future charging needs, one of the easiest, quickest things you could do for current residents, survey them. You can determine the current need, engage interest from your current residents. This can help justify and facilitate the process of installing chargers today, and then determine how many chargers you need to install when you're moving forward. If you already have a large influx of tenants that say we have an EV or we want EVs, that can allow you to basically have the push to get more chargers right now. If you don't have as much need, you might be able to have a little bit more flex time and figure out, okay, maybe we'll install 1 charger now and then figure out our plan to try to figure out funding to try to get more stations in the future. But this is just some survey question examples. It's just generally figuring out where people are at on your property, what the tenants want, and basically getting a better storyline of how you can supply that amenity to them. Different property determinations for considerations and policies. This is going to be the meat of this. This is a lot of different changes in the property type and everything. And so determining your installation approach. Basically, there's 3 different approaches for installing infrastructure depending on electrical access and then your parking space considerations. But typically, number 1, it's installed by the individual residents for their own use in coordination with the HOA and property manager. You can have the charging installed by the property owners or HOAs as part of a facility amenity. Or third, you can have it by a third party. You're having a different company come in, install the charger, and they basically are managing that. So you can like lease out a space to these third party providers and they're managing, doing all that. And then you're still allowing the residents to be able to use it, but you're not managing it itself. Assessing your electrical access. There's different types of electrical access on properties. Dedicated metering is one of those. It means each resident's electricity is metered by a dedicated electrical meter. There are different options you can utilize in order to get infrastructure for this dedicated metering. Option A, the property owner and manager can install charging stations and meters, and the resident pays for the electricity. Option B, property owner and manager pays for the wiring and conduit, and then it allows basically the space to be and meter to be EV ready. And then if the resident itself wants that EV infrastructure, they pay to install and they own that charging station themselves. And then when they move, they take it, but that wiring and conduit is still there for that next resident if they choose that they want EVSE. Common area metering is other type, a meter that measures electricity usage in common areas, parking lots, garages, pool areas, etc. Different considerations. It may be more cost effective to connect charging stations to common areas. Most of the time, there's a little bit more electrical capacity at these common sites. The property owner and manager will own the charging station and then does receive that bill for electricity in that common area, but it does not require any assigned parking. And so there is some benefits to that. Group metering, a single meter that measures electricity usage for an entire building or area without distinguishing among specific units. Considerations, that same thing, you get that bill for the electricity. However, it is difficult to determine the electrical consumption for single residence charging stations. And so if you have that group metering and then 2 people have EVSE and then 15 people don't, that obviously that charging is, that the electricity consumption is going up, but you can't really allocate and dedicate, okay, this is why XYZ, we can charge this person. And so it also doesn't require assigned parking per se, but there are some considerations within that. Mixed use metering is that last type of electrical access access consideration. It's a meter that measures electricity usage in multifamily areas, as well as nearby shopping centers, parks, office buildings that are in that mixed use kind of use. And so considerations for that, they are connected to a common area meter. Either the property manager or the shopping center owns and receives that bill, but there may be challenges with shared charging stations as adoptions grow. Basically, you're now sharing the, instead of just having your tenants and residents be able to use those charging stations, now you're kind of opening up for people that are utilizing those different public areas like the shopping centers, parks, all that. They're also utilizing that. So they're sharing that. And so if more and more people are adopting EVs, that station use is going to be spread out over more people. Parking considerations for each individual site. If you have assigned parking, each resident has an individual assigned parking space. This can work great because it can support an EV owner's individual need for guaranteed access. They're never worried that they're going to come home and someone's going to be in their space. It's their space, it's assigned, and they know they have a charger. However, if the resident's parking space is far from electrical service access point, the installation costs will be significantly higher. And so there are solutions for that. You could try to work with different residents to see, hey, okay, if they switch spaces, this space will be significantly cheaper to install infrastructure. So let's try to do that. However, that could cause a little bit of friction in between residents. So that is something that with policies, as people are moving in, figuring out all those different considerations as you move forward to try to mitigate any sort of friction in between trying to figure out these solutions. Deeded parking is kind of a level beyond the assigned parking. It is assigned parking, but people own their spaces. And so if you want to change in order to create that kind of easier transition to infrastructure, that does require a legal transfer of property. And because it is a piece of property, locations can have different value based upon resident owner convenience, preferences, things like that. So if your tenants do have deeded parking, it is still possible in order to change. However, it is a level of complication added on top of that. Common area parking, it allows several residents to share a charging station. Common area parking is usually located closer to electrical service access point, which can cause, like I mentioned, the lower cost installation, but it can be an alternative to reassigning private parking spaces. However, it's not always ideal because that common area parking, guests normally park there. It's usually in higher demand. It's not often covered like some assigned spaces are, and it may be far from that EV owner's unit. So while it is a solution, it's not the perfect solution, especially as EV adoption gets more frequent. Other parking factors, if your building and property has multi-level parking garages, these garages, most of the time, have very limited electrical capacity and were basically just designed for lighting and elevators. That's all that they were supposed to hold. And so if you're putting in a bunch of different charging stations, an electrical service upgrade may be required to support that load and charging. If you're trying to bore through garage walls, parking decks, it's going to be very costly. You're going to have to get multiple engineers involved. However, because it's a parking structure, it doesn't have that same kind of visual standard. And so there could be surface mounted conduit for circuit wiring that is acceptable. And so you can just put it near the side. You'll see that kind of tubing, things like that. It can be a little bit more industrial looked in order to try to get that to reduce the cost of boring through those walls, etc. This is probably the most important for property managers on this slide to take into account. Creating EVSE policy for your property, coming up with different scenarios and figuring out the plan of what you're going to do and what rules are needed to ensure that charging stations are used, maintained by residents, and basically enforced correctly. And so different topics of this are consider guidelines for time limits to encourage people to move their vehicle once charging is complete. If you have common area charging and you have 15 cars that would like to charge, and you have one charging space and one vehicle, you don't have a guideline or a policy for the amount of time someone can be there. Someone technically could just be like, do not charge in my car. I'm going to leave. I'm going overnight. And then you have 10 other cars that aren't able to charge their vehicle because they weren't there first. And so having guidelines in place for time limits, it could be you can charge for 2 hours and then that time the cost increases. So it can incentivize someone to move their vehicle, or you can have different policies in place for allowing others to unplug someone else's vehicle. Like, what are those? Is someone going to come to you complaining, someone touched my vehicle, someone did this? But if it's a policy, if this car is there for a certain amount of time, someone's able to change the plug over to my vehicle, get those in place to try to kind of control and mitigate any issues before they happen. Figure out whether you want these charging stations available for residents only, residents and their visitors, or to the general public. And so is it going to be behind the fence? Is it going to be in the front where anyone driving by, doesn't even have to be a visitor of the property, can use? And those are just different considerations to take into account, especially when you're planning on where and how many stations you're going to have on site. And then the appropriate enforcement of non-EV drivers blocking spaces. Is there going to be any sort of rules and enforcement in place if a normal vehicle, a normal internal combustion vehicle, goes and parks in that charging space and doesn't have an electric car? How are we going to control that? Is there someone, you're not going to, technically, it's not legally enforceable. You can't call the police to move these people, similar to what you can do in handicap spaces and things like that. This is just an added space. So just having that enforcement, or having the figuring out from the management perspective, and if someone complains or if this is happening. And then payment structure. Figure out, is this going to be a free amenity? Is it going to be fixed rate, which means it's essentially going to be one singular charge, regardless of what's happening. It can be a variable rate by time. Like I mentioned before, the guidelines for time limits, it's going to be this price for this amount of time. And once you get above that threshold, it's going to be a higher and higher rate, which could encourage people to change their cars out faster. It could be incorporated with fee with rent. And so that's something similar to almost like dog rent. Like, we want to accrue, we know that we're getting use of this, so you can add an additional fee, and then the actual resident's not paying anything at the actual plug. However, they're paying on that rent side. And then determining maintenance and repair responsibilities at the time of install. This is very important because many times you don't think about this until something happens. And then when something happens, you want something to turn around very quick. And if you don't know who's supposed to maintain, who's supposed to repair these, no one's really going to raise their hand and be like, oh, me. And so figuring out at the time of install what the procedure is in order to get those stations, if something happens, back up and running, and everyone knows who their responsibility is supposed to be on. Engaging your electric utility. This is something that you do early on before you install anything. This is very important for sites and planning. As EV adoption continues to grow, it's critical to engage early, so the utility can plan and prepare for the need to generate and deliver more electricity towards the site. Utilities can help determine if the local electric distribution service is adequate to support the planning EV infrastructure activity, how many stations you're planning on having. They can provide information to the property owner and customers on different utility rates. And then they can advise customers about electrical service and meter and equipment options necessary to support their installations. It's really important to get this in place. They're very good resources. And depending on where you live and where your property is, you may have a different contact in the utility service area. And so we try as a COG, we've tried to maintain and get a list of the best contacts at these utilities. So you can feel free to email us at cleancities@nctcog.org to try to find the best EV contact for your utility service area. And then in addition, on our website, if you are an Encore's utility of their territory, they have a free new construction EV management handout for guidance. And we have that listed on our website where you can download that, and it gives you a little bit more perspective over the steps and who to contact there. Funding, installation, and operation. This is basically all the money for this. And so this is a lot of information on these next couple of slides, but very important information. Installation and operation costs. The primary installation cost factors, you have that the actual equipment and installation costs. You can have make sure there's adequate building and wiring electrical capacity that could impact the cost of the total project. The distance between the electrical service access point and the desired charging sites, and then other construction requirements, including trenching, et cetera. The farther away something is from an electrical access point, that's going to be more expensive. It's more trenching, more everything. And so just being aware on your site, while you might have, okay, from a mapping perspective, I want it right here, but if you have it maybe 50, 100 feet away, it could reduce the construction cost of that by thousands of dollars. And so just like having that, keeping that in mind, and flexibility on where things are at. And then final, like the transformer and service capacity serving the community and figuring out, making sure you guys are aligned with that. Permitting, EVSE installations generally require a building permit, an electrical permit, or both. And permitting fees are non-negotiable, and they do vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So making sure you are getting your adequate permitting and having that in your cost estimates. And then finally, once things are installed and ready to go, you have your operation costs. Operation costs, if you have different charging companies that have, basically they're like computers. You can get it with a lot of different features on it. The more features you have on it, the more expensive that network access fee. It's almost like a data plan for these. And so depending on the services you're choosing for the unit, the more expensive it could be. And so that is something that's going to be a consistent cost. And so figure out the monthly operational costs, and that could impact how much you're charging for that specific station's use. You can have unanticipated equipment maintenance costs, just like any appliance, any sort of thing that you're purchasing. You're never wanting things to break down, but sometimes things happen. And so having that kind of backup money saved up to maintain these units so they can become consistent, reliable charging infrastructure, making sure you have that kind of banked up. And then finally, any demand charges that might apply to your commercial electric rates if the property owner pays for your charging in the common areas. That is going to increase your electricity consumption. And so like we mentioned before with the utility coordination early, your utility can assist with trying to do a billing analysis so property owners can try to plan and recover those costs. We don't want anything to be a hit. We don't want anything to be a surprise later where you feel like you were bamboozled per se into getting this, and now you can't pay for it because you didn't have the cost structure basically forecasted correctly. And so just taking all those things into account can allow the best kind of transition and the best use, and making sure everyone's happy and aware of how these stations can run. Funding right now, we have that call to action. We want you to apply now. Right now, there is funding available. And so it's not always available. There is a timeline on it. So right now, the Volkswagen Settlement Texas Mitigation Plan, Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure has level 2 charging funding available right now. And so it reimburses up to $2,500 per installation, and that can't exceed 70% of the cost for the installation of publicly available EV chargers. So that means anyone can access them, and then 60% of cost for EV chargers at workplaces or multi-unit dwellings. And so basically that line of differentiation means the multi-unit dwelling, you could be behind your fence, you can be behind your garage, and only residents can use it. You don't have to have it where any person can access it. However, if it's in an open place on the street or something where any person in the area can access it, you can get up to that 70%. But like I said, can't go over that $2,500 per installation. We are noticing and have heard that that $2,500 is pretty much not going to cover the total 60% of costs, especially depending on how many features you're getting within that. So do keep that into consideration. But however, if you're private, you're able to double dip that Volkswagen money with the alternative fuel infrastructure tax credit, which is a tax credit equal to 30% of the cost of the EVSE, not to exceed $30,000. So you can use that 30% in addition to the $2,500 together for your installations. The Volkswagen settlement money does have a deadline of September of this year, and it does have a first come first served basis. And so we are encouraging people to take advantage of that as soon as possible to ensure that you can get that. And this is only in Texas, this Volkswagen settlement money. And then the alternative fuel infrastructure tax credit is a federal tax credit. However, you do have to install that before December 31st. These are hyperlinks. You can get more information there, but we have a full list of available funding opportunities that we track through the Council of Governments at that hyperlink there. This is just kind of a breakdown so far of that level 2, the Volkswagen level 2 infrastructure. So far, They just did an update, so there are some updated numbers we have to get analyzed so far. But as the last update, over 213 people had applied thus far for a total of over $500,000. There's over $10 million available for these. And so there's a lot of money, but once people start applying, it's first come, first serve. So that could go down really quick depending on how many people are applying for how many stations. And so it is only available for multi-unit dwellings, public charging, and workplaces. And so almost half of the applicants have been through multi-unit dwellings, which is great so far, but it is for the whole state. And so we selfishly want to get as much money as we can in DFW area. And so we want people to apply more and more and more so we can get the most money of this 10 million. So if you have any questions with that, you can reach out to us. We can help you do different application questions or reach out on your behalf for a certain question and basically make sure that you understand how easy the process is. City of Dallas already applied for some of this funding, and so they'd be happy to talk about their kind of steps that they did for that as well within the question portions if you like more information on that. But there are other funding that we are anticipating to come out later this year. Just to kind of hit it home with this, funding is not always available. And so planning out early so you know what you want and what you need before funding comes out is really important, because when that funding hits, you're able to be ready, move forward, get the funding, get the project ready to move, and then move on. And so some later funding that's coming out, the Alternative Fueling Facilities Program, we're expecting that to open later this year. There's not a specific date. It does cover 50% of the total eligible costs for EV chargers, but public stations for this one are considered before private stations. And so private stations, if you're having it in a garage at a multi-unit dwelling, you will not get the highest precedence for this one. Volkswagen settlement does not have this delineation of priority. And so if you are looking for those private stations at your properties, definitely try to take advantage of the funding now. But there is some funding that could be available later if you can't get the applications in by September. The Volkswagen settlement additionally has a different round opening later this year for DC fast chargers. It is a different funding threshold. We're not sure what it's going to be yet, but it will be a higher threshold than the level 2 reimbursement because those chargers are significantly more expensive. Finally, once you get the funding, you get your charging infrastructure installed. It's there, you did the hard work, but now you need to make sure people are using it. And so promote and engage to your residents. It's vital to increase station usage by adequate signage for awareness. People know that stations are there. You don't always have to announce it to every person visiting the property, but if there's signage and awareness of that station, someone driving by, if they have an EV, will know it's there and they'll park there and use that. You can do this by painting parking spots, differentiating the area to increase awareness, adequate lighting for safety of this. Compliance with ADA requirements, making sure it's fully accessible for someone that might have a disability to be able to access that space and charge their electric vehicle. And then promote use and availability to residents to maximize usage. Send it out in a mailer. Figure out how you can let all these residents know that these amenities are now on site. And then finally, add it as an amenity to your website. When people today, or when they're looking for apartments, most of the time they're searching online for that. And so they're looking at your websites, they're trying to see what amenities you have, and they're using apartment search sites. And so you can look and try to figure out how to add charging available on site to those search engines. And so when people are searching and putting different criteria that they're looking for, dog friendly, EV charging on site, your sites and properties are coming up on that list. And then finally, if your charging is available to the public, making sure that that station is added to different EVSE search tools. So that could include the AFDC station locator, which is managed by the Department of Energy, or PlugShare. That's another really popular one. Make sure EV users can become aware of your stations and then further increase the usage and awareness of that. And then finally, this is just something that we're working on doing a little bit more research on behalf of the region. It's something that's coming more frequent across the country, but it's EV parking, infrastructure, and building specifications. And so if you guys have heard of EV ready codes and ordinances that different cities across the country are adopting, this is basically the building side of making sure the buildings are wired correctly and ready for this EV transition. And so when we see EV capable, people are putting different goals where basically a certain percentage or threshold of their spaces in their new construction for both commercial and residential in multifamily, it would be a certain threshold that would be considered EV capable in that new construction. So 20% of their spaces would have the electrical panel capacity, branch circuit, and raceway set up and wired for EV installation. EV ready basically means it's EV capable with an outlet there. And then EV installed means that it's all ready to go. It has a station already installed, ready to go, and vehicles can already use it to charge up. We as an agency are starting a working group for North Texas electric vehicle and building industry stakeholders to help with guidance and development of regional resources to provide consistency in EV capable and EV ready construction. We want to know from y'all's perspective, from the multifamily perspective, how, if this was passed in our region, or we had some different sort of resources and guidelines, what are the different factors that would impact y'all's construction, or different concerns you have? Are you backing it? Do you have different, basically any sort of guidance you have on our side? We have the vehicle perspective, we have the government side, but you guys are the ones managing the properties, and would impact your actual construction. And so we would love to have you guys included in the group if you're interested. You can email me at bmuller@nctcog.org by May 15th to be added into that group, and we would love to have your insight. Why we think this is important to talk about right now: you can plan early and save a lot of money. You can plan to incorporate EV readiness in your next construction and new build to help your property save money over time. They say it's 4 to 6 times less expensive to install EV capable infrastructure during new construction than if you were to go back and do a retrofit. And when people have done a bunch of analysis in the areas that have already kind of adopted these different standards, it comes down to the approximately 0.1 to 0.5% of the total cost added to the new construction project and multifamily residential projects as a whole. And so it's not a huge thing. It's not increasing your project budget by 20%, it's less than 1% of those costs. And over time, it can save you a significant amount of money, because you're basically demolition, repair of surface parking lot, you're negating that, you're negating breaking and repairing walls, longer conduit runs, upgrading electrical service, extra permitting, all of that stuff. You're taking that out of the equation. And so there are a lot of cost benefits if you're planning and incorporating that kind of stuff in early. These are just some examples of EV ready goals and standards while you guys are looking at maybe expanding your property. These are just what different cities across the country have done. And so that red box is noting the different percentages of what they are requiring for different new construction standards for multifamily. And so it's not that significant yet. It's 2% EV, like St. Louis, 2% EV installed, 5% EV ready spaces of the total parking available on site. And so you can just see the different thresholds of when you're planning how much. We're not expecting you to have EV capability for every space on your property. However, maybe doing a 5% goal in the next 2 years, and then 10%, 20%, figuring out how to get that EV capability ready. So when, and if the EV kind of influx comes and impacts your property, you guys can be ready for it, and it's not as big of a financial hit. But that's pretty much what we had quickly. And so I know we're kind of short on time. We have about 5 minutes. And so we can take some questions now if there's any sort of pertinent questions.
Hey, Bailey, this is Dorothy with the COG. There is a couple of comments / questions in the chat. I don't know if they want to go off mute and say their questions, but I can just go ahead and bring those to y'all's attention. So are there any comments from presenters or that are Encore potentially for incentivizing and expediting EV infrastructure interconnection? in particular, helping identifying local distribution, grid capacity issues, and potential HV locations associated with multifamily is if this is even feasible. So I don't know if anyone from Encore wants to answer that, or if you all want to take a shot.
If anyone from Encore is on the line and wants to take a shot at that, that would be very welcome. I see a couple of you guys are on the line.
Yeah, I see David Treichler is on there too, but this is Tom Anthony. We have been maybe a little bit behind the curve in getting up to speed on this also, just as so many of us have. But we, as Bailey mentioned in the presentation, we have developed a specific form for electric vehicles that can be provided, that Encore asks to be provided to it. We now have a designated person at Encore to take electric vehicle questions, a dedicated person in our new construction management group. And he not only has worked with, he's also been working with fleets. So he has pretty good experience at this. As far as incentivizing, Encore, as long as it makes sense, is not allowed to own the equipment at this time, but we can do the make ready to get it up to the meter base, especially if the costs are within our guidelines, which for the most part they will be. And as far as identifying if there are issues, I'll really be honest, I don't know why an HV DC charger would be desired in a multifamily location, because you saw the cost of it. It's a very high dollar, but we can identify circuits and what their load is and determine even all the way back to our substations if there's going to be some kind of work that's going to need to be done at a higher level. Now, as I said, the individual that we have has been working with fleets, and we have identified if fleets were to go over massively with some of their commercial vehicles, a large number of their commercial vehicles, we are going to have to do some incredible amounts of upgrade on our facilities. But number one, I don't know why you'd have an HV DC charger at a multifamily, but if you did, it would just be depend on what we determine the load is as far as what, but we can identify if something's going to be overloaded or not with the information that you would provide us.
Are there any other questions? I'm looking at the chat, seeing that there was 2 questions in regards to Encore, but Tom just covered that. So if there's any other questions, we can give you guys a minute or 2 to think through, but we are open, both City of Dallas as well as COG. If you think of any questions later, we'd love to do one-on-one call, help you out through any overlying questions you may have on anything in regards to EVs in general. And so with that, I guess we can end it. We do appreciate you guys for having us here and allowing us to present this information. We are working to try to expand multi-family charging across the region. This is an extremely important area and kind of dedicated group of people that we are trying to make sure have the access to charging. And so, like I said before, we do appreciate you having us here, and we would love to work with all of you more in the future.
Thanks again so much, Bailey and Katie, for being with us today, sharing this excellent information. We will have a recording of the presentation that we'll share with all of our members and make available on our website at aagdallas.com. And also the slides and all the other information. We've got a flyer that talks about the grant funding. So we look forward to working with you in the future to expand these opportunities, and want to thank everyone again for joining us today, and have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.